is to increase health literacy awareness. One of the common challenge in academia is writing a scientific paper. Therefore, today's event of guidance on choosing and writing a valuable scientific paper might be the correct answer for your problem. First, I want to introduce our moderator, Dr. Darmawati Ayu. Slide. Dr. Darmawati Ayu is a Master of Science Medicine. Currently, she is a physiology lecturer at Diponegoro University. She got her master's degree from Diponegoro University and conducted her thesis research at Murdoch Children's Research Institute at the University of Melbourne. Outside academia, she is active as the advisory board in a running community in Semarang. Next, today's distinguished speaker. Meet the speaker, Dr. Swapnika Ramu, the scientific editor at MET, part of a journal from Cell Press. She got her PhD in molecular biology in the laboratory of Dr. Yong Kwon Hong at the University of Southern California. She's also a co-creator of online edX course. And then in 2018, she joined the editorial team at iScience, the first broad scope interdisciplinary journal from Cell Press. Without further ado, the panel is yours, Dr. Dai.
Thank you, Andita. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's 6 p.m. in Indonesia. I'm the moderator today. We are going to have interesting session about health literacy awareness. And the title is about how to publish, how to make a good scientific publishing. So today, we're going to have the talk for about 30 minutes from Dr. Swapnika, and then we will continue with Q&A session. So before I give the floor to Dr. Swapnika, I will explain about the technicalities about the questions. You may ask questions by typing questions in the chat room, chat box. You can start anytime during the talk, and then secondly, you can do the raise hand, and then I will give you the opportunity, and then you can unmute and ask the question directly. And the third, you can ask in Bahasa Indonesia as well. We can translate for the questions. So I hope we can pay attention and focus to the next 30 minutes with Dr. Swapnika. Dr. Swapnika, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now, and please let me know when you can see my slides. Are they visible or not really?
No, we haven't seen. Wait.
Okay, let's try that one more time.
Okay, we can see now.
Okay, and I realize that if you can see my slides, then for some reason I'm not able to see them. So that's going to be a little interesting.
Do you need any help? Can I share? Can I do the share screen instead?
Yes, actually, I think that would be better, because this way I'm not actually able to see what I'm sharing. So that's a bit problematic.
Okay, please wait. Do you want to continue? Wait. Okay. Share screen. Wait. Can you all see now?
Yep. And I will just ask you to move on to the next slide when I'm done explaining this one. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Again, thank you very much for coming on a Sunday and taking some time to learn about scientific publishing. What I'm hoping to do today is to give you a very broad overview of how scientific publishing works and some very basic tips and guidance on what makes a good scientific paper. Of course, there are a number of resources that are available out there, which will give you a lot more detailed information. I've also included some links at the end of my presentation in a slide, and I'm happy for you to circulate the slides among yourselves to refer to it later. And there's also a ton of resources on the internet that can give you more information. What I'm really hoping to do today is, apart from this general introduction, hear from you. So your questions, comments about scientific publishing, any doubts you may have about how the process works, anything I can clarify for you. So I'm really hoping this will be a nice interactive session. So, about 30 minutes or so for me to talk, and then the rest of it, I hope we will be able to discuss questions you may have about how the publishing process works. So next slide, please. So this is just an overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to start by giving you a brief introduction to Cell Press, which is where I work, and to Med, which is the journal where I serve as scientific editor. After that, I'm going to talk about manuscript preparation. So that's the first step in terms of how you would choose a journal and then how you would actually write your paper for it to be most effective. And after that, I'm going to move on to a discussion of the actual submission process. So when you have a paper, it's ready to submit, what you do then, and also certain aspects of peer review, things like pre-submission inquiries, and then what everybody in the peer review process does, what the editor does, what the reviewer does, how we make decisions as editors, what are we thinking of when we decide what to do with a paper. And then at the end, again, as I mentioned, some resources that you can use to learn more about any of these things. So next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, I am an editor at Cell Press. Cell Press is one of the brands published by Elsevier, which is, I believe, the largest publishing company in the world, if not one of the largest scientific publishers. Elsevier itself publishes, I don't know, hundreds or thousands of journals across a variety of scientific disciplines, but Cell Press in particular is much smaller. We publish 28 primary research journals across all fields of science. So Cell Press started as a life science publisher, but now we have moved beyond that. So our flagship title in biology is Cell, which perhaps some of you have heard of. We now have flagship titles in physics and chemistry, material sciences, environment, and finally, medicine. So a few years ago, Cell Press really expanded into the clinical and translational space, and Med is the flagship journal there. We also have 17 open access journals in this portfolio. So they're all listed here. We have 16 trends journals, which publish reviews. So they don't publish primary research content, but just review articles. And we also have 10 partner journals where we partnered with scientific societies, such as the Society for Biophysics, and we publish Biophysical Journal and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, so Med, where I work, what is Med all about? So Med represents the latest step in the evolution of Cell Press from a life science publisher to an all science publisher. So in this timeline, you can see that Cell was established in 1974 as the Journal for Exciting Biology. And there, the understanding was very much that it would be focused on fundamental biological discoveries. Since then, Cell Press has grown rapidly. In 2016, 2017, we started moving into the physical sciences with the launch of Chem and Joule, which are our flagship chemistry and energy journals. And then in 2020, we launched Med. So our vision for Med was to serve as a platform that will bring together people who are working in healthcare research across the spectrum. So people in academic centers who are doing clinical research, clinicians who are working with patients, but also people from the biotech and the pharma industries who are carrying out research to develop new drugs or new devices or diagnostic tools or what have you. Also people from the regulatory and policy side of things. So people who decide how advances in healthcare get implemented, how they are distributed to people. So what we want to do is serve as a platform that brings together all of these different people. So we really have an idea of what it takes to get a promising discovery from the laboratory bench actually into the clinic and to the bedside where it can help patients. So that's our fairly ambitious goal for the journal. In terms of subject matter that Med publishes, we publish across all areas of the health sciences and medicine. So some of those topics are listed there, all of the standard ones, but more than this as well. So the one that's pretty obvious would be COVID. So we've been publishing a lot of COVID content as well, in addition to all of this. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get into the actual discussion about publishing. So before I get into all of this, maybe we can have a show of hands or something of how many of you are either working on a project that you think you will be publishing a paper about fairly soon, say in the next 6 months or a year, or you've already published something. If I can just see how many of you have done that before. Okay, by the looks of it, not too many people, just a few. Okay, all right, that's great. So then some of you will find this fairly introductory, but nonetheless, I think it's important to have this information out there. So really, I mean, why publish at all? Many of you are clinicians, you treat patients, people come to you, they're unwell, you make them better. That seems to be good enough. You know, why would you need to publish anything? So it's really one of the most critical steps in the scientific research process. You know, you do some research that you think is exciting, that holds promise, but then you need to communicate it to the scientific community so that people can build on your work and advance science. So that's why it's essential to publish. And what sorts of things should you be publishing? I mean, some of these are fairly obvious. You want to be publishing new or original results, new methods, something that advances the scientific field. Maybe something's already been published, but your work helps to clarify it, helps to analyze it in greater depth, provides a new interpretation, a new way of thinking about it. Maybe you want to publish a review article, which is to summarize the state of a particular field or to provide a comprehensive review so that people who don't necessarily know about the field will get an idea of what the latest developments are. And as I said, you want to publish work that advances scientific knowledge, not repeating it. So basically, you want to move the scientific discussion forward. Things you shouldn't publish, again, fairly obvious, obviously things that are not of any scientific interest, topics that nobody cares about, work that's out of date. So either scientifically or technically, the field has already moved on, but you're publishing something that is perhaps 5 years out of date. That's not something you want to publish. Something that's just a duplication of previously published work. So we know these results already and you're publishing the same thing again. And finally, things that are incorrect. So you don't want to be publishing scientific data that is based on flawed methodology or flawed interpretation. So really what you need is a high quality manuscript so that you can present your contributions to the scientific community. Next slide, please. Okay. So now that we know why you should publish, these are some basic questions that it's worth asking yourself before you sit down to actually write a manuscript. And in fact, if you are working on a research project, the goal is to ultimately publish your findings. So you should be probably asking yourself these questions even then. So how original is your idea? Is it something new? Is it something that's been done before? Is it developing on previous knowledge? Is it in advance? How much of an advance? So are you just, has somebody already gotten these results in system A and you're just presenting them in system B? Is that something that people are going to care about in your field? Is that exciting? Is there anything challenging in your work? Have you developed a new technology or a new method or a new tool or a new way of analysis that might help other people in the field? Is your work related to a topic of high interest? So for example, for clinical researchers, are you meeting an unmet clinical need? Is there a particular disease that doesn't have an effective treatment, or a treatment that is very expensive or that is hard to get, and you have a way that's actually better? So something like that, which leads into the next point about providing solutions to difficult problems. Is, again, there's a disease that doesn't have a treatment, or we don't understand how the disease develops, or it's a question of catching patients early enough. By the time you catch the disease, it's very difficult to treat. So you want to catch them earlier. You want better tools to diagnose. You want better tools to predict risk, who is likely to respond well to a particular therapy or not. So these are all important questions. And then, does your work help to clarify an ongoing scientific debate? So sometimes in scientific fields, as I'm sure we all know, there is no one right answer. Different groups of people believe different things about, how a disease develops, when is the best time to treat, what is the best drug combination you should be using to treat patients. So in areas like that, does your work help to provide clarification? Are you supporting one theory over another, or are you showing that one method of treatment is actually better than the other? And this is not an exhaustive list. There are many more things you can ask yourself, but really, if you can answer yes to at least some, or indeed all of these questions, then yes, you have something that's worth publishing and you should move forward. Next slide, please. Okay, so tips on choosing a journal. This actually is enough of a topic that I could probably spend 30 minutes just talking about this one alone. But just to give you a brief summary, there's any number of journals out there. As I said, Elsevier alone publishes hundreds or thousands of journals. So in a situation like that, where we're just one publisher and there are many others, there's an absolute abundance of scientific journals. So how do you pick the one that's right for you? Well, here are some tips to help you with that. So the first thing you do is you start with what you know. So if you're working on a scientific project, if you are doing scientific research, then presumably you have already engaged with the scientific literature in your area. You've already looked at publications to get a sense of the background of your field, the development of your field, to understand where your research fits into the field. So you've already engaged with the literature. So where do those people publish? The leading papers in your area of research, which journals are they in? Sometimes they may be in very broad scope journals. So to give you an example, the New England Journal of Medicine is a very broad scope journal. Med is a broad scope journal. Anything to do with medicine will end up there. On the other hand, it may be published in a specialist journal. So something like a journal that's only read by people doing cardiovascular research or people doing research into respiratory medicine. So those are much narrower in scope. So what is the pattern that your community follows? Where do people tend to publish? Another way to do it is to ask your colleagues and collaborators, which journals have they published with in the past? Where did they feel their paper was handled well? Where did they feel that the right people were reading their work? So again, if you're publishing in a broad scope journal, lots of people are going to read your work, but some of them may not know your field. On the other hand, if you publish in a specialty journal, fewer people might actually read it, but they're all experts in your field. They know your field. So, you have to weigh what matters more to you. Do you want a lot of people? Do you want a broad scope? Do you want a very broad readership? Or do you want your research to be narrower? Again, that's something you need to think about. Survey the publishing landscape. Get a feel for what journals are out there and what kinds of papers they publish and who reads them. So ways that you can do that, there are indexing databases. So things like Web of Science or Scopus, or I haven't listed it, but PubMed. These are all indexing services that basically index scientific journals and everything they publish. So you can use these as a starting point to get lists of journals. So for example, Web of Science has journal lists. You can use these to look up journals that publish in your field of interest. I've also listed journal finders below. So the Web of Science journal finder, the Directory of Open Access Publishing, or DOAJ. Various scientific publishers also have specific resources. So Elsevier has something called a journal finder, where you can actually look up which Elsevier journal might be a good fit in terms of topic for what you're working on. So there are really a number of resources that you can use to help you pick a journal. And I would suggest actually spending a good amount of time on this one, because the success or failure of your manuscript really depends quite a bit on where you send it. So you want to send it to the right place. You want to have it go to the right home and spend as little time as possible doing the rounds of multiple publishers trying to figure out where your paper fits. So the more time you spend on this stage, the less time you have to spend later on trying to figure out what happens when the first journal says, no, this isn't a fit, and then you have to keep moving on. A really important corollary to all of this is beware of predatory journals. So this is unfortunately a growing problem in the scientific field. As I'm sure you all know, predatory journals are those which do not offer any quality control. They will publish if you pay them. That's all that counts. So they don't assess scientific validity. They don't assess whether the work was properly done. Really, they're only interested in taking your money, and then they will publish whatever you send them, even if it's not scientifically accurate. And the problem with that is sometimes the websites can look somewhat legitimate, and it's easy to get confused and send them papers and then have them be in a venue that is associated with very bad quality. So even if your work is good, chances are likely that people will either not read it or they will assume that it is scientifically flawed. And I have heard of cases where, for example, authors realize too late that after submission, this journal is a predatory journal, I don't want my paper there. but then the publisher says, no, we're not going to let you withdraw your paper and publish it somewhere else. So they're almost holding your paper hostage in a way. So again, there are a lot of resources online that will help you identify what a predatory journal looks like. Their websites look bad. They don't have standard journal metrics indicated on their website. There's a lot of missing information. So I'm not going to go into that, but you can definitely educate yourself about what predatory journals look like and make sure that you avoid them when you're trying to pick the right journal for your work. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on from just picking a title, here are some more nuanced metrics you can use to assess whether the journal is the right fit for you. So again, what's the scope of the journal? Is it very broad? Is it narrow? Is there going to be a significant chunk of the readership that does not know what you're working on? Something really obvious, if you're a clinical researcher, then you don't want a journal that publishes basic biology. So, you want to publish in the New England, not in, Developmental Cell, for example. So things like that. Who's reading the journal? This is also really important and perhaps something that's worth thinking about as much as the scope. Who do you want to see? Who should be seeing your paper? Is it a small journal? Is it a global journal? Is it broad scope? Is it narrow? What are the types of papers they publish? What are the topics they publish in? All of this is worth thinking about in terms of who's going to see your work. And where do you think your work will have the maximum impact? Are these results that you think will be useful to people globally? Will they be useful to people only in Southeast Asia? Will they be useful to people only in the global South? All of these are questions you should be asking yourself. Who can benefit from knowing what you've done? What's the quality of papers they're already publishing? How thorough are they? How extensive are they? Are they very data rich? Do they publish shorter papers? How well do those papers get cited? How many people are reading those? So, you can use citation metrics and they will tell you how often papers get cited. That also gives you journal metrics, things like the H index of the journal or a cite score, which are sort of rough indicators of how often people cite content from that journal. Again, if you look at an indexing service like Scopus or Web of Science, all this information is there. And oftentimes journals also provide this information on their own journal website, which is actually a sign of legitimacy. So they'll tell you things, if they have an H index or a cite score, they might mention it somewhere. They'll have a lot of information on their journal website. So for example, handling times. So if you submit a paper, how long does it take for the editor to decide whether they're sending it out for review or not, which is called the initial decision? How long does it take for the peer review process? When can you, if you submit a paper, it's been peer reviewed and it gets published, how long is that? So they give you all of these time frames. There's a lot of other information that they'll provide as well. So they will be very clear about the aims and scope that should be listed clearly on the journal website. They'll tell you who their advisory board is. So the editorial board is usually a bunch of editors, a bunch of experts in the field who serve as advisors for the journal. So they, as an editor, I can ask any of these advisory board members in their field, what is the latest advance? If I have a paper that I'm unsure about, sometimes I can ask them for an expert opinion, and they really help to shape the content and vision for the journal. And again, if it's a legitimate journal, all of those people will be listed. Do you recognize any of them? Are they experts in your field? Do you know them? Are they well recognized? If they are, then that's a good sign that this is the right journal for you. They know your field. It attracts the best people in your field. Journals will also be upfront about publication charges. So as you know, if you publish in an open access journal, you have to pay and what is called an APC at Cell Press. That's an article processing charge. If it's a subscription journal like Med, for example, you don't have to pay to publish, but people have to pay to read it. So does that matter to you? Do you want to be in an open access journal? Do you have mandates from your funders? So funders across the world are increasingly moving towards this open access model where they want people to have their results be freely available to everyone. So, look at the charges. Are there any? And if there are, what's it like? Usually, journals will also indicate when they are able to offer waivers. So a lot of journals, including mine, if you are from countries where the scientific infrastructure is less well established, we can actually give you waivers or discounts on publication charges. All of that information should be listed on the journal website. You should be able to find it easily. So that's another practical consideration of, can you afford to pay here? And are there discounts that you can avail of? So all of these things are things that you should keep in mind when deciding whether a particular journal is the right journal for you to publish in. Next slide. Great. You anticipated that one very well. So, okay, now you've done all your research, you've taken the time, you've got the right journal, you think this is the venue where, the right people are going to read your work and your work is going to get the attention and the importance that it deserves. You also have great results after, a lot of hard work. You've put in all the work into your scientific project and you've gotten some really nice data that you're very excited about. Now comes the fun part, which is actually writing the paper, which a lot of people find as difficult or more than actually doing the research itself. So when you're writing the paper, here are some very broad guidelines to keep in mind, again, from the point of view of an editor. So if I were reading a paper, these are all the things I would look for. To me, a good scientific paper tells a story. So it tells a story of, it sets up the history. This was the state of the field. Then it highlights the open questions. These were the things we knew. These were the things we didn't know. And then it puts your project in that context and saying, because we did not know these things, that's why we did this project. Then explain how you did it. First you set up by saying, okay, we decided to analyze this particular thing in that particular system, or, we decided to test this drug in these patients. And then you move on to what you actually got. When you're telling a story, the idea is to keep the audience's interest. So you want people at every stage to think, oh, this is great. I wonder what they did next. And then the flow should be like that, where, it's like reading a really good book, right? Like you always want to turn the next page and say, oh, what happened next in the story? I really want to know. So you want to retain that same feeling when you're actually writing a paper. Every experiment should be logically connected to the one that went before. At the same time, you don't want to make it too simple. You want to provide enough details so that people who are reading really understand what you did and why. And also keep in mind that the journal's readership may be broad, it may be focused. So that depends, that really changes the way you write about it. So if you are working on, let's say, a cancer immunotherapy drug and you are publishing in a specialist cancer immunotherapy journal, then maybe you don't need to give the whole history of, once upon a time, somebody decided to look at immune cells in the tumor and figure out what happened. And then all of these other things happened. If it's a broad scope journal, you might want to introduce your field a little bit better. If there is some specialist knowledge or some specific jargon or abbreviations that only people in your field know, then you might want to explain it if other people are going to be reading it as well. So as important as deciding what to put in your paper is deciding what to leave out. So I think we all know that, it's very nice to read a paper where they did experiments A, B, C, D, and E, and they got this nice result and everyone's excited. But in real life, when you're actually doing the research, it never goes that smoothly. You do experiment A, it didn't work. Something went wrong. You change the conditions, you try again, you get a result and you say, great, and you move on to the next thing, but then you got an unexpected finding, which is actually very interesting. So now you have to change your whole research direction and say, hold on, I wasn't expecting to see this. This is something we need to study even further. So, research takes a lot of twists and turns and dead ends and some stories that you abandon halfway and some unexpected story that actually turns out to be the main finding of your work. So that's all great when you're doing the research, not so much when you're writing it. So you don't want to, overwhelm the reader with every single thing that you had done, every single abandoned experiment, every single failed idea. You want to trim it down and only keep the focus on the things that are important. And it may not necessarily be in chronological order either. So you don't have to write about the work in the exact order in which you did it. Sometimes logically, it makes sense to move things around a little bit because that makes the story clearer and simpler rather than just very strictly going by timeline alone. And the last thing, which I think is also very important, is have someone else read your paper. So once you've written it, you know the work, this makes sense to you, you know what you did, you know how the experiments went. So that's fine. But the best way to make sure that it actually makes sense is to give it to someone else who doesn't know the details of the project and ask them, does this make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Are there bits that are obscure or hard to understand, or there are abbreviations that you don't know what they are? So it's always good to get an external viewpoint. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through the different parts of a paper and really what you can do to make sure each of them is as effective as it can be. So the first is, of course, the title. You want the title to be succinct, so don't have like, a 30-word, analyzing sodium, glucose, and potassium levels in 50-year-old patients with a history of smoking. That's a terrible title. No one's going to read that. You want it to be short, you want it to be catchy, you want it to summarize the key content so that people who just read the title will get an idea of what the paper is about. And again, avoiding obscure abbreviations, avoiding jargon, avoiding a lot of details. So for example, not saying that, assessing the effectiveness of blah, blah, blah immunotherapy in XYZ mouse model, like that's again, obscure, that's detailed, it's not required. So just keep it short, keep it simple, just summarize the key findings as far as possible. And, think of yourself, what title would make you excited to read the paper? How could you make it attractive to people to say, wow, okay, that sounds interesting, I should read that. So, move away from the science a little bit and just think about what you would find interesting and catchy and then use that. Next slide. Okay, so then after the title comes the abstract. When you're writing the abstract, one good thing to do is actually look up the journal's information for authors. So it's usually called, at CellPress, it's called information for authors. At other publishers, they may call it something else. But it basically tells you how they expect you to structure each section of the paper. Why this is important is because Med, for example, has something called a structured abstract. So we have very specific sections that we want people to fill out because it's a medical journal. So things like who funded the research, what method you used, what were your key results, summarized very briefly. So formats may vary. So it's a good idea to consult the format of the journal you're aiming to submit to make sure that you're on the right track. But, what does a good abstract look like? It should be interesting. It should be broadly understandable. So it should not require some very specialist knowledge to understand. It should be accurate. So, report what you've got. It should be specific to your paper. So it should not have a general introduction to the field. It should be very brief and succinct, mostly focused on what you did. So the point of the abstract is really, it's like a trailer for your paper. So it should highlight all of the key findings, the importance of the results, one line in the beginning, maybe that sort of sets up the history, a line or two at the end that highlights why this is important. And then the middle is all what you actually did. The one thing you want to be careful about is not overselling your abstract. So your abstract sounds like, oh my God, we cured cancer. And, in reality, you did not. So you want to be careful of that. And you want to make sure that your abstract accurately reflects your results. So if you've tested something, let's say in one mouse model, your abstract should not say tested in a variety of animal models. And this sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but you would be surprised how many papers actually have abstracts that don't match very well with the actual content of the paper. And sometimes there are also abstracts that are not well written that actually undersell the paper. The paper is far more interesting than the abstract makes it sound. So you want to strike the right balance between not overselling your work, but not making it sound so boring that no one actually reads the paper, which would be a pity. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on from the abstract, the next section is the introduction. So the introduction is really to provide a very broad overview of the field for people who don't necessarily know it, or just as a reminder. So, where does the field stand? What do we know? What has previous work shown? What have others in the field? What are the theories that people currently believe? Or what's the current standard of treatment for a particular disease? And then what problem are you addressing? So what do we know? What do we not know? And, why the things we don't know are the reason why you actually did this project. And then, what solution did your work propose? So how did you address this question? What did you do? Very briefly, what do your findings show? And any limitations that might be relevant. So for example, you've tested this, it looks very promising, but you did a phase 1 study, which was small. So now if you really want to know if this therapy works, you'll ultimately have to do a phase 3. So, things like that. Next section, please. Okay, so the next part of the paper after the introduction is the results. So this is where you actually talk about the data that you got from your project. So again, these are fairly obvious things, but still worth stating because a lot of papers don't actually do this very well in different ways. First is, of course, you want to be clear and easy to understand. So you want people to be able to understand what you've done. You don't want to get into unnecessary levels of detail. So, providing some information about your experimental methods is good, but really the details are going to be in the methodology section at the end of the paper. So you don't need to tell people about every single thing that you did in like really, really fine detail. Going back to the idea of telling a story, you want your results to be well organized, you want it to be logical so that the person who reads the first experiment will be like, oh, I wonder if they did this. And then that is going to be the next experiment. And it's also important, I think, to actually articulate in writing the transition from one experiment to the next. So to say, we did this, we found this, and therefore we decided to test it in another model, and therefore we did the next thing, that sort of thing. So really making sure the transitions between one piece of data and the next are clear cut. Of course, you want to highlight the main findings, that's the whole point, but you also want to talk about unexpected findings. So some drug which you thought would work very well, but for whatever reason did not work as well as you expected, something where you expected something to go up, but it actually went down, unexpected things like that. It's really important to highlight those because you don't know how useful those might be. They might actually help to advance the scientific conversation as well. Another really, really important aspect is the statistical analysis. So here you want to be very, very clear about what kind of statistical tests were used, why you used them, and what the results were. And usually, again, if you read a scientific paper, you'll see all this, right? Like they'll report p-values or confidence intervals or some other measure to tell you that the statistics are reliable. All of that should be there. It's going to be in more details in the methods anyway. Most journals, Med, for example, definitely has an entire section in the methods, which is just for statistical analysis. So you don't need to get into like super granular levels of detail, but enough to let the readers know that, yes, your statistics are robust and your findings actually mean something, they hold up. And the last is make sure that your figures and your illustrations are as good as you can get them. For example, Med will help authors, if you have an abstract that summarizes your findings, but it doesn't look very nice. I mean, it conveys the information, but it kind of looks clunky and you want it to look beautiful and artistic. We can help you with that. But I mean, if you let us know, we'll help you. But really, you want your results to be presented in figures that are clear. Your figure legends should have all the relevant information. Simple things like color schemes, make sure that like the colors are clear to see, because this is going to, I mean, people will be looking at it online. There will also be a print version. So these are all things to think about, how you can most effectively present your results in terms of figures that actually make sense. Everything's clearly labeled. The reader doesn't have to wade through 5 pages of text to understand what's happening. It should be fairly obvious. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we're in the last part of the paper, which is the discussion. So the discussion is where you sort of circle back a little bit to the introduction and say, well, we had this problem. Now you've read all these results, which should hopefully convince you that we have, at least in part, solved that problem. So what do the results mean? This is where you can talk about the bigger picture. So, we showed this, this, and this. This is what we already know from the literature. So this suggests, for example, that maybe this particular pathway is very important in this disease and we should spend more time studying it. So discussion should, of course, correspond to the results. So, picking up key points from the results and then expanding on those in the discussion. Like, what does this really mean broadly? So not just in terms of that experiment, but for the field, what does this mean? Compare published results with your own. So again, what we know and how you've advanced it. As an example, in a clinical study, you tested some drug, another study reported an efficacy of 33%. You reported an efficacy of 50%. So, how? What was the difference? Why is the previous literature reporting a different number? Or people have reported contradictory results. They've shown that a particular disease develops in a certain way, but you've shown something else. So again, all of this discussion about previous work and how your work fits in. And then finally, another aspect which is really, really important is highlighting the limitations of your work. So at Med and now broadly across CellPress, we have something called a limitations of the study section where you're explicitly asked to identify the weaknesses of your work. And I mean, no scientific paper is ever going to be the be all and end all. It's not like one paper can answer every single question in research field. So it's obvious that there are still things that you don't know. You can't possibly, if you're running a clinical trial, I mean, you can't test like 1 million people if you want to, analyze a new drug or something. So there's obvious limitations, and you should be upfront about that. So saying that, we've tested this particular drug, but we only tested it in Indonesia, so we don't know how people in, say, China are going to respond to it, or people in Switzerland, from different parts of the world. So we still need to figure that out. Or we've only tested this in one mouse model, but we don't know what would happen, for example, if we tested it in rats or monkeys or people. So obvious limitations that you should be upfront about. And this is actually a good thing because it convinces the readers that you've been very thoughtful about what you've done, what you know, and what you don't know. Because this is the kind of transparency that's really important to advance scientific knowledge. And of course, as part of the limitations, you also want to talk about future directions. So, you found something very exciting, but now you want to build on that. Or someone else in the field wants to build on it. What should they do? So for example, I've tested this drug in Indonesia. It would be very interesting if someone could test it in Switzerland and see whether people of, different genetic background respond the same way. Or, I've found this one pathway that seems like it might be very important in the development of breast cancer. It would be cool to develop a drug and see if you can actually influence disease outcomes, things like that. So all of that is, again, pretty important to highlight. Next, please. Okay, so all of those things that I was just telling you were about the actual process of writing a paper. Let's say you've got through that, you followed all those points, you've taken the time, you've sat down, you've written your manuscript, and you think you're ready to go. What do you do next? One option, of course, is you just submit the paper directly. Journals will have information on how and where to submit. You just do that. The other thing you can do is something called a pre-submission inquiry. So a pre-submission inquiry is actually something that you can do even if you don't have the full paper ready. You can write to the editor and say, dear editor, I'm working on a manuscript that looks at XYZ. Is this something that your journal would be interested in? Why would you want to do something like this? What's the point? Well, maybe you're not sure whether this topic is something the journal is interested in. Like, especially for a broad scope journal, they publish a lot. So do they really care about your particular field? You might want to find out. You might want to get a sense of whether the editors are likely to respond favorably to the work or not. So you're saving yourself a little bit of time there instead of submitting the full paper and then having them come back and say, no, this isn't the right fit for the journal. Maybe you have some questions about the journal. Maybe you have some questions about your work. Maybe you're like, you send a pre-submission inquiry to Med saying, I know you guys publish clinical work, but I've done everything in a mouse model. Would you still be interested? Maybe you have a competitive situation. Maybe you know that someone else is working on something very similar. So you want to move things forward quickly. So you get in touch with the editor. So if you want to send a pre-submission inquiry, how would you do it? All journals will list some kind of information, contact information for a pre-submission inquiry. There'll be an email address that you can send them to, or you can directly contact the editors. Our contact information is also listed on the journal's homepage. So you can email either of these options with an abstract of your paper, with the summary, with a brief explanation of what your paper is about and why you did this work and why it's important. Maybe you can send some figures if you have them. What I would not recommend is sending the full manuscript, because at the pre-submission stage, editors don't have the time to read the full paper. And even if they do, they're going to read it very, very briefly. So it's really not worth it. You're better off sending a short summary and asking, is this something you'd be interested in? The advantages of doing this is that most pre-submission inquiries are responded to very quickly. So at Med, for example, we aim to respond within 2 to 3 business days and tell you whether your paper sounds like a good fit for the journal or not. And it's like having a conversation with me, right? Like, you can ask me, do you like this? And if not, why? Like, if I say, no, this isn't a fit for the journal, you can always come back and say, okay, then what would I need to do to make this a good paper for Med? Or what are you expecting to see? Or where else do you think I should be going with this paper? Is there another journal I could publish in instead? Next. Okay, so let's say you've either submitted a pre-submission inquiry and you got a positive response, or you know that your paper is a good fit for the topic of the journal. So you just decide to go ahead and submit. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're actually submitting the paper. Definitely at CellPress and maybe at other publishers as well, we don't care about the format at this stage. So I know a lot of authors are worried about, do we need to format the paper? Do you want it in the exact style that your publisher recommends? And at initial submission, no. So you can just submit the format and the paper in whatever format it is, and then we'll work with you to form, depending on how things go, if we agree that we want to publish it after peer review, we can work on the formatting later. So not something to worry about too much, but that doesn't mean that you just send us like a random collection of figures and text. It should be at least in some basic manuscript style. What's very important is to include any relevant information. So for example, if you have a related manuscript that's under consideration elsewhere, it's nice if you can tell us that and then send us that unpublished manuscript. What's also really important is making sure your raw data is accessible to reviewers. So anybody that reviews a scientific paper will actually want to see the raw data on which your conclusions are based. So you ran a clinical trial in Indonesia, you looked at data from 350 patients. Okay, maybe you can't provide raw patient data, but you can at least provide some aggregated de-identified numbers. So whatever raw data you can provide, you should provide, because reviewers would like to see it and make sure that your analysis is correct. And the next thing is the cover letter, which I'll get to on the next slide. Okay, so the cover letter, different editors assign different levels of importance to the cover letter. Some people really don't care about it that much. Others care about it a lot. I'd say me personally, I'm somewhere on the neutral scale. So if you have a terrible cover letter, it's not going to sink your paper. If you have a fantastic cover letter, obviously I'll be more interested. So what looks like a fantastic cover letter? Think of it as a way to have a confidential conversation with editors. So you can say things that you can't say in the actual text. So for example, in your cover letter, you can say things like, this is a very controversial field and there is a lot of debate. Whereas in your paper, you might want to say something like, different theories have been proposed. You may not want to say controversial, things like that. Make sure you address it to the right journal. This sounds again very obvious, but you would be surprised how many papers we get where the cover letter is actually addressed to some other journal. So, make sure you have the journal right, the information right. Explain how this paper fits the scope of the journal, what's the broad relevance, why is it important, what's the scientific advance. But here, there's no point in repeating the abstract because we're going to read the abstract anyway. So you want to summarize it much more briefly and highlight what you think is really exciting. If there are related papers or competitive situations, other groups are working on the same thing, please mention it. Another important thing that the cover letter does is to provide reviewer suggestions. So you're welcome to suggest experts who you think are best placed to review your paper. We recommend that you suggest people who you know are going to be broad-minded, who are critical, who will have useful things to say, who are experts in your field, who know the field. You would be surprised how many reviewer suggestions I get where the reviewer really does not have expertise in the paper at all and would not be the right person. So don't just pick names out of a hat, but actually think about who the right people would be. Avoid people with whom you have a conflict of interest, your friends, your family, your postdoc advisor with whom you're still working, or a close collaborator, someone you've published with a lot in the past few years, because we'll find out. I mean, these are all things we look for anyway. So if there is a conflict of interest, we'll figure it out. So, don't waste a reviewer slot suggesting somebody that we are just going to exclude because of a conflict. But at the same time, you're also welcome to suggest people who you think should not be reviewing your manuscript. People who have a different opinion in your field than what you do. People who are competitors, you know that they're working on similar things and you don't want them to see your work. That's fine. You can tell us, we will honor those to the best of our ability. We will not invite those people. You do need to be reasonable about it. You can't say, for example, don't invite anybody from Indonesia at all, from any university, because they might be prejudiced. I mean, that's not going to work. And, you need to be a little bit reasonable there. Next slide, please. Okay, so what editors look for in a paper? So really, what am I looking for when I read a scientific paper? Now, I'm an editor of a broad scope journal. And my expertise is in cancer biology, a very small segment of cancer biology. But I will be reading papers in immunotherapy, in aging, in developing new diagnostic tools, and I'm not an expert. So what are the things that I use as tools to assess whether a paper looks like the right fit for med? Obvious things, is it the right scope? Does it fit the scope of the journal? Is it something that we'd be interested in? How important is the question? Is this something that is really going to affect our understanding of a disease or the way we treat a disease? Is it really going to benefit patients? Again, from a med specific point of view. What's the advance over previous work? What's been published in this field before, and how much of an advance is this? Is it just a refinement of something we already knew? Or is this a really big advance, something brand new, something we really had no idea about? Does it seem technically sound? Are people using the right experimental model? Are they using sufficient numbers of replicates? Do their statistics broadly look reasonable? How well is the data presented? Does it make sense? Are there obvious gaps in the work that haven't been addressed? Is there an obvious experiment that doesn't seem to have been done or that hasn't been written about? And broadly, how interesting is this? Is this something that the readership at my journal would care about? Would they be interested in reading about this? So these are all things that I would look for in a research paper. Next slide, please. If it's a review article that you're writing, the criteria are slightly different. Some of them are the same, so of course the scope is the same. But since a review is meant to be a summary of knowledge in an existing field, what I'd be looking for here is to understand why this review now. So what has happened in the field that you think it's good to have a review? So for example, a number of new drugs may have recently been developed for a particular disease. So it's a nice idea to have a review that summarizes all the recent developments. Maybe there's a fresh perspective. So there's a known research question, but you're approaching it from a different angle. I'm also looking for it to be balanced. So it should provide a reasonable overview of the literature without necessarily favoring one side or one opinion over the other. It needs to be authoritative. So it should really present a lot of information nicely summarized about the field. For a review in particular, your figures do need to be very good because this is something that readers are really going to use a lot. And it needs to be well written and broadly accessible. Again, something that's going to be interesting to to readers, even if they're not experts in the field, they should be able to appreciate the importance of what you're talking about. Next slide. All right. So, these are the criteria that I've used to judge a paper. A paper has been assigned to me. What happens next? So the way it works is, the paper gets submitted. The editors or the staff will decide which specific editor on the team is going to handle that paper, and they get designated as the handling editor. So what the handling editor does is to read the actual paper, the entire manuscript in depth, look at all the experiments, look at all the data, look at all the information, and then discuss it with their colleagues. So, I will read the paper, I will look at previous literature, I will look at the experimental model, and I will assess how important I think this is. Does this seem important to me? And then I'll discuss it with my team. And we will have a fairly open discussion about, do you think this is exciting? Do you think this is interesting? Do you think this is something we should publish? A lot of it also depends on the journal's bar. So really in a particular field, what kinds of papers are we looking to publish? So we might decide that, for example, in field X, we only want to publish results which demonstrably improve clinical outcomes. So if this paper doesn't do that, we won't publish it. Those kinds of things. And based on this internal discussion, we decide whether or not we want to review the paper, send it out for peer review. If we do, then as a handling editor, it's my responsibility to manage the review process, to find reviewers, to make sure they submit their comments in time, to send you the results of the peer review process. And then, of course, once the paper is ready for publication, to make sure it gets promoted, highlighted across cell press, so everybody knows, hey, Med published this cool paper and you should read it. Next slide, please. Okay, so I talked about this initial discussion that we have within the team and whether to send a paper out for review or not. Again, there are two outcomes here. Either we decide we're not going to review it, in which case we'll send you the paper back, but we'll explain to you why we think it's not a good fit for the journal. The other option, of course, is that we decide to send it out for review. And at that point, as the handling editor, I will find the right reviewers for the paper. I'll keep in mind your suggestions. And I'll also keep in mind the people that you've asked to be excluded for conflicts. Next slide, please. Let's say we decided to send the paper out. What are we asking reviewers to evaluate? So of course, reviewers are the experts in the field. They know the field very well, not just the conceptual knowledge, but also the technical details. So we ask them to assess first, among other things, the technical quality of the data. Are these experiments done well? Are they done to a high scientific standard? Are people, authors using the right models? Do they have the right number of replicates? Do they have the right controls? All of those kinds of things. Do the data really support the conclusions? If you want to say that pathway A is important in disease B, is this amount of data enough, or are there other experiments which need to be done as well? And we're also looking to get feedback on the level of interest. So, for an expert in the field, do they think this paper is interesting? Do they think it advances the state of knowledge in their particular field? Is it likely to be broadly interesting? Would people from outside the field also care about this? Is this important enough? These are all things that we ask reviewers to assess. Next slide. Okay, so we've sent the paper out for review. We've got the right reviewers. They've sent us their feedback. I get all the reviewer reports as the handling editor. What happens next? So my job as the handling editor would be to take the reviewers' comments and integrate it with everything else. And what everything else in this case would be is my own assessment of the paper. So when I initially read the paper and discussed it with my team, what did I think? Then the nature of the anticipated revisions. What are the reviewers asking for? Are they asking for some simple experiments? Are they asking for a lot of additional work? Are they asking for the kinds of stuff that you think is going to take a really long time to do? Depending on what the reviews are like, we can also go back to the reviewers for clarification if there's something we don't understand. We can also ask an external expert. Sometimes reviewers are completely opposed. One person will say this paper is great, and the other person will say, no, I don't think you should be publishing this. So, or one reviewer will say this data analysis looks fine, and the other one will say, no, that data analysis is not okay. In which case, we might actually consult a third person and say, look, I have this disagreement. Can you help me resolve this? So as you can see from this, it's not a simple, yes, we'll publish, no, we won't publish. There's a lot more that goes into the analysis than just the reviewer recommendations alone. Okay, I have a question in the chat, and I'm just going to finish this slide, and then I'm going to answer that question. So I was talking about integrating all of this different information, which we do, and then based on that, we'll write a letter to the authors to provide the outcome, and we'll specify what we want authors to be doing in response to all of these points that have been raised in the review process. And I'm going to move on to the question that we have, which is, I've heard there's some situations where the reviewer and author get blinded with each other, or in other words, both will be anonymous to avoid bias. Is this practice common in scientific journals? So yes, double-blind peer review is a thing. It is not very common as far as I know of. So for example, I don't know of a single self-press journal that does it. I can see that there would definitely be some advantages there. It does help to eliminate bias in some ways. But unfortunately, the way the publishing system is set up now, it's really hard to do double-blind peer review. So it's really hard not to tell reviewers who the authors are, where they come from, and things like that. So it's a great idea. I think it's a little difficult to actually execute in practice. So that's why it's not particularly widespread. We also have a raised hand, if there was a question there.
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Ramu. I have a question about, I think, how we present the result, like figures or tables in result section is very important. And I once faced the problem because the editor said that the table and the feature is presented by me is not interesting enough to be in the manuscript. So how do you think about that? How is the importance of the figure and data presentation in the result section from the writer to be eligible enough to publish in the journal? Thank you.
So that's a great question. And yes, of course, presenting your results well is very, very important. I would say, though, that data presentation is not necessarily the reason I would reject a paper, unless the data was presented so badly that it was impossible to understand what actually had been done. So I think a good rule of thumb for designing an effective figure, let's say a figure that presents data from your study, right? So the way I would think about it is, can someone understand that figure without having to read the paper? So, if you're presenting a graph, or if you're presenting, immunofluorescence, or if you're presenting a chart of some kind, really, is it clear enough? Is it well labeled enough that someone doesn't have to read like 5 pages of text, the figure legends, the actual results section? Can they just look at the figure and get a sense of what you've done? So I think that is really the key point. And what I would suggest, if you're having some difficulty in understanding what's the most effective way of presenting figures, again, there's a lot of information out there, number of resources you can refer to. The easiest way I would do it is just look at other papers in your field, papers that have been published in good journals, papers that get cited a lot, and use that as a model. Look at the way they've presented their data, how they have thought about presenting different types of data as well. And then, use that as a guide to start structuring your own figures. So personally, when I was a graduate student, I found it very useful to actually look at published figures, not to copy them, but to get this idea of saying, oh, if you do this kind of experiment, then that's the most effective way of presenting your data. If you have that kind of data, this is how you should show it. So using published work, I think, is a great guide. And you can always ask the editor, if they have comments like, yeah, this data is not presented well, there's no harm in asking and saying, well, then, what is the expected standard? And they might point you to something and say, this is how you should be doing it. So yeah, those are some suggestions I would have for addressing this question of data presentation quality.
For the answer. Could I ask one more question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm interested in the math scope about the health policy.
Yeah.
And how the maths editor or reviewer expecting from us when we try to make the health policy manuscript, because I think the health policy in every country might be varied, might be different, and maybe not as objective like the other scope. So how the maths expecting from us when we try to write that?
Sure. I think for health policy in particular, what we would be looking for is, are there learnings from this work that can be implemented elsewhere in the world? So for example, if you've done a project about, I don't know, I'm going to say like, health literacy or something, like you've shown that having community workers to go out and educate people about a particular, like, preventive healthcare or something, and this really improved outcomes, and this is a policy that should be implemented. Great. So is that something that is relevant only to Indonesia, or whichever country, or is it something that people broadly across the world could learn from? So someone, say, sitting in India could look at this study and say, hey, this is a cool model, and this is a nice policy idea. This is an important policy change. We should think about implementing it too. So specifically for med, I think we would be looking for applicability beyond just where the study was done. But there are also region-specific journals that are less bothered about broad translation. So for example, one of the Lancet regional health titles, for example, if you're publishing in one of those, they wouldn't really care that much. So again, it really depends where you send your work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so can we move on to the next slide, please? All right, so I was talking about the review process, about integrating feedback from different sources to provide a decision to authors. So when we're presenting that decision, one thing that we think about is, what would it take to publish this paper in my journal? How far away is it from being publishable? So this never happens, but sometimes everything might be positive enough that we can just publish the paper as it is. That never happens. Very, very, very vanishingly rare to have a paper that is reviewed and we accept it immediately. That's almost never going to happen. The best case scenario is just minor revisions where, the reviewers think that, yeah, this is pretty solid already. And if they just do a few small things, it'll be fine. Or if they just clarify a few points, we're all set. Sometimes the concerns are a little bit more major. And then in that case, we'll ask the authors to respond to those, something that you think of as a major revision, but we are specific about what you would need to do. So it's not just saying, yeah, just, whatever the reviewer said, just do that stuff. We're going to be clear about, this particular experiment is very important and you should really, really do this one thing. Or, they've asked for clarification on your method, so please make sure you do that. In some cases, when we think the amount of work that it's going to take to get the paper to publication is just way too much, we will probably tell authors, what, this doesn't seem like a reasonable amount of work. You should probably move on with this paper and go elsewhere. So if, for example, reviewers are asking you to implement a whole new animal model, that's going to be a ton of work and probably not something you want to do. So in that case, we'll tell you that it probably doesn't make sense. Next slide. Okay, so if you've gotten a revision decision, things that you should do, you can read the letter and figure out whether the suggested experiments seem reasonable. Sometimes there are pretty solid reasons for why you can't do something. You may not have access to a particular kind of equipment that is required for certain experiments, or that particular model is not available at your institution, or those samples were something that you pulled out of the freezer and now they're gone and you can't repeat the analysis or whatever. So if you have any of these limitations, you should let us know. You can think about if there are different ways to do it. So in some cases, some experiments are, like, for example, technically just really, really hard to do. So you can think about, is there a substitute? Is there something else I can use that will still answer this question? If you have all these points, you really should reach out to the editor and discuss them before you submit the revision. So I can't emphasize this enough. The editor is there to be a resource for you as the author. So you should make the maximum use of it. Write to editors, ask for clarification. Certainly anyone on my team would be very happy to tell you whether something sounds reasonable or not. And sometimes I'll proactively reach out to authors and say, look, you really should be discussing this with me. Before you revise the paper, let's talk. And at the revision, so if you've had this conversation, you've done some additional work, you made revisions to your paper. When you're resubmitting the paper, you should always include a detailed point-by-point response, which actually says, the reviewer said this, we did that. The reviewer said this, we changed that. The reviewer asked us to clarify something, here it is. So making it very clear exactly what you did in response to the original comments, it makes it much, much easier to evaluate. And again, the revision is probably going to be seen by maybe all the original reviewers, some of the original reviewers, it really depends, to get their feedback. Next slide, please. Okay, so if you've gotten a negative decision, either your paper has not been reviewed at all, or it was reviewed and the editor said, no, I'm sorry, I don't think this is a good fit for my journal. What you can do? Of course, this is disappointing and we understand that. So maybe the first thing you want to do is step away from your computer and give yourself a little bit of a break, process your feelings. Don't write angry emails and say, how could you reject my paper? Because we do get those and we're as unhappy as you. So you've taken the time, you've cooled off. Read the letter and understand the basis for the decision. Does it seem reasonable or does it seem not accurate? Or in some cases, you feel like, no, hey, I can actually do what they're asking me to do. This isn't that hard. They asked me to provide data on additional patients, but I actually have that and I can do it. So if that's the case, or if there's something else in the decision that doesn't make sense to you, you can always contact the editor and ask for clarifications, ask for guidance. We are open to discussing potential rejections with you, as long as it's based in science. So if you have a scientific question, if you have a scientific thing that you want to bring up and discuss, happy to talk about it. Maybe you read the letter and you think, you know what, this is actually fair. They're asking me to do way too much additional work and I don't have the time and I don't have the resources and I want to publish this paper as it is. I don't want to do all this extra stuff. In that case, you can actually consider a transfer. See, the advantage there is that your paper's already been reviewed usually, and the other recipient journal can use those reviews to make a decision. So within CellPress, we have a really robust transfer ecosystem. When I am rejecting a paper for whatever reason, I will usually recommend to authors, look, I'm sorry, med is not the right place for you, but you might want to consider this other CellPress journal. Very often, either I or someone else at CellPress will reach out to other editors and say, hey, we have this paper, it was in med, it's not going to make it for med, would you be interested? And often editors will say yes, and we don't want them to make too many changes. If they just make these few minor revisions, we'll take it, or we can just publish it as it is. We don't want them to change anything. So all of this is to say that the transfer option is one that will save you time in finding the right home. Instead of taking your entire paper and then again trying all of the different journals, we can speed that process up for you internally. And again, other publishers have this too, so this isn't just a CellPress thing. But if you are offered a transfer, it's a good idea to investigate and really think about whether maybe you want to take it, because it might end up saving you a lot of time and you can just publish faster. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is actually my last slide. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I don't know if that's been too much information, but I was talking about additional resources that you could use, and this is actually a great one. So Researcher Academy at Elsevier has a ton of learning modules and information about any aspect of the scientific publication process that you might think of. So how to write an effective paper, what are the sorts of ethical things you should keep in mind, scientific publishing ethics, plagiarism, conflict of interest, or, how to structure a manuscript, how to work, how to write reference, how to organize your references, like how to manage that kind of stuff, like really anything you can think of. So I would strongly encourage you to go and look at this resource. You will definitely find something that will help you as a guide while you are going through the publication process, or just generally thinking about scientific publications. And there's a lot of information that's also geared towards early career researchers or people just at, in different parts of the world. So again, very useful, very relevant. Strongly encourage you to check it out. And I think with that, if we go to the next slide, that's actually the end of my presentation. So, yep, there we are. So, okay, I'm done talking. So I'm happy to take any additional questions that you might have.
Okay, thank you very much. I will be very, very short. This is very, very interesting, and I can very interesting tips, very helpful as well from the editor herself. So we can not only know the introduction to scientific writing, but also the practical tips about how to write a good paper and then how to submit. To those of you just come, I will briefly share some tips that I find it very, very helpful. The first one is to beware of the predator journal, and also remember that abstract is a trailer, like a trailer for a movie. So that's very helpful, I think. And it's more important to leave out than to think what to write, but what to cut from your writing. So we have seen a few questions here. I will try to read first. It's in Bahasa, and he chat me personally, personal chat. So I will read for you, Dr. Swapnika. So can you share to us what are the most frequently found mistakes in reviewing papers, particularly from authors from Indonesia? Is there any typical methodological or technical errors that we may gain insight from? So that's the first.
Okay, so in all fairness, I have not dealt with a lot of papers from Indonesia in particular, so my advice would be fairly generous. And I think if I understand correctly, you're asking about some of the top mistakes that authors make that end up affecting the paper in the peer review process. Is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so let me see. I think the most obvious error that people make is just not presenting their data accurately. So overstating your conclusions, being really dramatic about, oh my God, this data is really important because we cured cancer with this, and it's not the case. The other thing that's a very obvious one. I think the other thing that sinks a lot of papers is just not being technically accurate. So you want to be very, very clear that you have the right number of samples, your statistics are sound, you have the right controls. So when you're doing a particular experiment, the control experiments that you do are just as important as the actual, test itself. So making sure you have the right controls. And I think one other thing to keep in mind is just generally lack of transparency. How did you analyze your results? If you're using a particular statistical test, how did you calculate whatever you did? I feel like oftentimes authors are not very clear about what they've done and how they did it in terms of both the technical stuff, but also the analysis, the statistics. And that tends to really put reviewers off, because if they can't understand how you did what you did, they are not going to be very positive. So yeah, just off the top of my head, I'd say things like overclaiming, technical inaccuracies, and just lack of transparency. Those are some of the big mistakes that I see authors making.
Okay, very nice insights. Thank you. I think that's very basic mistake. Like that's the problem with our knowledge about the research methodology, I believe. So the second question would be, I've heard there is some situation where the reviewer and author gets blinded with each other, or in other words, both will be anonymous to avoid bias. Is this practice common in scientific journals?
So I answered that one about double-blind peer review, and that's a good idea, but very difficult to do in practice. I will say though that sort of not exactly addressing this point, but somewhat related is this idea of transparency in peer review. So at CellPress, for example, we had this pilot where we would publish all the reviews that a paper got. So when you read a paper, you would actually see the original manuscript, you would see all the reviews, whatever the reviewers wrote, all of them would be out there. And then you would see, the revised version. So you'd be able to follow what happened to the paper during the peer review process, what reviewer said. So that's, again, in practice, very difficult to implement, but we have piloted, and there are other journals that are trying this as well in different formats to just sort of increase the transparency around how peer review actually works, and hopefully to also eliminate any conscious or unconscious bias. So for example, if you're concerned that, I'm a researcher from India and I'm worried that somebody sitting in the United States is going to judge my work unfairly, then the more transparency you have, the less chances there are of something like this happening. So not quite the same thing, but yeah, I can see why this double-blinded peer review idea is increasing transparency and being, increasing author fairness. So this is another way in which some publishers are trying to address that.
Okay, yeah, very insightful. Thank you. We're waiting for more questions. I see a few participants here are doctorate students. I give the mic to Brigitta. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. Brigitta, please.
Hello, can you hear me clearly? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah. First of all, I'm sorry for not being able to turn on my camera. Second of all, I thank you so much, Swapnika, for such a great presentation and very informative insight for us. My question is, how would the editor decide whether a reviewer is a good fit to review a manuscript? Because in my experience, once we get a published, once we publish a manuscript as a first author, then that particular journal would offer to us whether we want to be like a reviewer, whether we want to opt in to become a reviewer in the future. If if a manuscript within our expertise is available. But that makes me question and doubt whether I am in a capacity to to review that paper, because basically just because I am not finished with my education yet. And I'm wondering if anybody else is having the same thought, or they're kind of quote to quote overconfident with their capacity as a reviewer. So how would the editor decide? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So how do I pick reviewers, basically? I will say that at CellPress, we don't automatically do that thing where if you've authored a paper for us, then immediately we're like, yeah, you should be a reviewer. It's not that clear cut. So the criteria that I use to assess who should be reviewing this paper, the first and most obvious is scientific expertise. So I want somebody who is in the same field, who knows that topic. I look at their publication record. Have they been publishing well? Have they been publishing important papers in that field? Are they generally acknowledged as someone who is a well-established researcher in that area? So that's the first criterion, and that's something I would look for sure. Sometimes a paper may be the type of study that spans multiple disciplines. So for example, it might be a study of cardiovascular complications from diabetes, in which case I want somebody with expertise in diabetes. I want somebody with expertise in cardiovascular biology. So those are kind of two different things. So I want to make sure that I have people with all of those. Or, you have a new diagnostic tool that requires some kind of new gel to be applied or something like that. Like, I'm just making this up. But then you want people with expertise in the actual, manufacturing of that thing, and then also how it works and how it affects patients. So looking for people with the appropriate expertise is the first one. Other things that I look at is I'm trying to invite more women. So I will try and find women researchers. I will try and find researchers from all over the world. So I try not, it's not always easy to do that, but I will try and not just invite people from, say, the United States or Europe, but I will try and, especially if it is something that's relevant to global health, I will try and invite people from, other parts of the world as well. I try and get a mix of scientific experts and early career researchers. So sometimes, the postdoc that actually was the first author on the paper actually knows the technology and the methods and the very fine details. They know them really well, probably much better than the senior author who is sitting in their office and has not done an experiment for 20 years. So I'll try and get a mix. So I'll get, someone who's very senior. Then I might also try and get someone who is an early career researcher or, a postdoc or a young faculty member who's publishing good work, so that I have a nice mix of opinions from people who are experts all the way to people who know the methods very well. And then the last thing I'll do is, if this is a field where there's some controversy or some debate, I'll try and get people from different points of view. So I don't want people who all say, oh, we believe in theory A, or we only believe in theory B. I want to mix. I want people who are likely to be critical. I don't want people who are just going to say, this is awesome, you should publish it, I have no questions. I want people who are really going to engage and think and say, I'm not convinced. I don't agree with this argument. I think about this differently. I want them to do this, this, and that, because it'll actually help improve the paper and give substantial comments. So yeah, all of these are things that I think about when I'm actually deciding who I want to invite.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Meanwhile, waiting for more questions from doctorate students from Japan, maybe, or anyone. I want to highlight, thank you very much, Dr. Swapnika, for mentioning for allowing us to circulate your presentation today. So that's going to be very helpful. And then that mention about being inclusive about choosing reviewers, that's very helpful. Now I understand in your CV about being collaborative in your field. So that's very helpful as well. And then I want to highlight as well that it's very relieving for us, as future authors, let's say, to be able to communicate freely, to have like a dialogue to the editors by making up pre-submission inquiries, and also to discuss, just to clarify the reviews that the authors get. I think that's very novel for us, that we think if we get reviews, then we just have to do it or not and then give up. But there's a room for discussion. That's very relieving.
Do we have any questions in the chat, maybe?
This is great way to mitigate diversity. Okay. Thank you so much for the amazing insight. We heard in scientific publishing about publication bias, that positive findings are more likely to get published. In your experience, how chance that negative or not significant can be published in high-tier journal?
Well,
so
if
it's diversity. Thank you.
So if it's not significant, then obviously it's not going to get published in a high-tier journal because it's not impactful. Negative results can get published in high-tier journals depending on the importance of the question that they're answering. So for example, if you're showing that a particular drug is not effective in patients, that's important information because that will influence the way patients are treated. So for example, the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, actually publishes a number of negative studies where they will, for example, compare two treatments. So let's say they have patients coming in with stroke and they'll say, is it useful to give them drug A or is it useful to give them a combination of A and B? And then they will say, the combination actually didn't do much, so you can just go with drug A, the combination didn't work. But these are all results that from the clinical point of view are very important because you need to know the right way to treat patients, you need to know the right drugs to give them, the right kinds of surgery, the right methods. So depending on the importance of the question being asked, yes, I would say you can publish negative results in a high-tier journal. It's much easier to think of for clinical studies. It's very easy to think of a negative result that is still very important. Less so for things that are like more fundamental biology, unless you are disproving something that the field has always thought to be correct. If it's so there, I think the burden of proof is higher. For clinical studies, I think it's very easy to think of a negative result that could still be very important and still end up getting published in a really good journal.
I see. Yeah. You can always ask in Bahasa Indonesia. Anyone? You can chat or ask in Bahasa, because this is a very good opportunity. I will read question from Agung. He's a doctorate student in Japan, Kobe University. No, Tottori University. I heard that there is possibility that some study will be flooded out without any comment from editor or reviewer. Do you have any tips to avoid this? So at least we have some comment to improve our paper.
Do you mean by flooding out, do you mean that the paper is just going to get rejected with no feedback?
Yes.
Okay. It can happen. Papers, if it's what we call a desk rejection, which in other words means that I as an editor read the paper and I say, no, this is not a good fit for me, and I reject it without sending it out to review. Usually I will try and provide at least some feedback and say something about why I think this paper is not a good fit. It's not going to be very detailed. I'm not going to go into details about, well, in figure A, you showed this, but that's not very convincing. And in figure B, it was this other thing, and I didn't quite like that either. I won't go into that level of detail, but I will provide some broad guidelines about why I think, this is interesting, but it's preliminary. You would need to do a lot of extra work. So maybe not for men. That said, you're welcome to write to the editor and ask for clarification and say, okay, you think this is not a good fit. What should I do? I mean, what would you expect to see? Are there any experiments that I could have done? Is there some additional work? I will say though, and this is off the record, there are some papers for which I do not provide any comments at all. And those are the ones that are just really, really, really bad. And you can tell that it's a study that has been sitting around for 10 years and someone just pulled it out of their drawer and said, hey, I should try publishing this, or it's really badly written. I can't understand what the authors have done, or it's just completely out of scope. Like they haven't checked the scope of my journal at all. So we're a clinical journal, but they're, sending us something about, I don't know, physics or something. And these things can happen. So, in that case, I'm not going to give you feedback because there is really not much I can say. I do want to add though, and this is something that I didn't bring up during my presentation, and it's not quite related to this question, but I still think it's important, so I want to mention it. When I talk to authors from countries where English is not the first language, they're really worried quite often about English. They're like, my English is not good, or I'm not very confident in my English speaking skills. Is that going to affect my work? Honestly, no. So, if there's lots of things you can do to improve the quality of the language. If you're worried, you can, ask other people who have better command of the language. Maybe you have a collaborator in some country where English is the first language, so you can ask them to take a look. If you have the money, there are services that will actually do this for you for a fee. They will edit the language for you. But my suggestion, if you're worried about the language, just keep your paper very simple. Don't try and write, fancy sentences, long sentences, big paragraphs of stuff. If you're just worried that you're not going to be able to convey your message effectively, just make your paper as simple as possible. Don't try and make it flowery. It's fine. I mean, I'm here to judge the science. Like, I'm not here to judge, oh, this is a very beautiful phrase, or, they describe this so nicely. Like, you don't have to do that. Just keep it really, really simple. Let the science speak for itself. The language, unless the language is so bad that I can't understand what you're talking about, then we have a problem. But if it's basic, it's standards like, I did this experiment, I got this result, this is interesting, this is why this is interesting, because it shows something. Okay, good, we're fine. So English per se, or just language quality, unless it's absolutely unreadable, it's not going to be the reason why you reject a paper. And it's something that can easily be fixed at later stages of the peer review process, and not something to worry about.
Okay, thank you very much for helpful tips on the language. That's what we are worried about as well, I believe. Okay, so I don't think there are more questions. Is there anyone? Oh, okay, Brigita, do you want to ask more questions? Please unmute yourself.
Hi, yes. May I ask last question, please? So how would a top tier journal like yours minimize the potential of bias during the editorial or like the peer review process? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really important question and a very good point. So there can be, different kinds of bias, and certainly as an editor, what I'm doing is, when I get the review comments, there's a set of comments that are meant to be shared with the authors, which is, actual suggestions. We also do ask for confidential comments from reviewers, and we ask them to tell us what they think. Is this important? Is this not important? And why that's useful is sometimes that helps them to summarize the overall impression of a paper, what they think. And sometimes, they just don't want to tell you that they don't think it's that great, so they can tell us and we'll decide. But also as an editor, what I'm doing is trying to assess what the criticisms are based on. So are people critiquing your work because they think the model is bad, the statistics are bad, the controls are bad, this isn't the right population, there's something wrong with your study design? Or are they providing criticisms which seem unfair? Now, this doesn't happen, at least, if you've chosen a review as well, this should not happen or happen very rarely. But there can be occasions on which reviewers, I feel, are being unnecessarily critical of a paper. Now, I don't have the capacity to know why they're doing it. I don't know if they're doing it because the author is a woman, or she's from an underrepresented country or something else. I don't know, but I know that there is something wrong. Like, this doesn't sound right to me. In which case, as editors, we do have the power to either, if reviewers are making very inflammatory statements, if they're saying things which are very harsh and very critical, we can ask them to go back and remove it and say, this, like, I'm giving you a very extreme example, but you can't say something like only an idiot would design this experiment. Like, nobody actually says that. But as an example, that's completely unconstructive. That does not help anyone. It just upsets the author, and it's not actually something that you can use to improve your paper. So I have the power to go back to the reviewer and say, I'm sorry, but you can't say that. So you're going to have to take it out. In really extreme cases, I can either drop the review entirely. So I'm like, yeah, these comments are useless. There's no point in passing them on to the author. It's not going to serve any purpose. I can drop it. Or I will share the comments with you and tell you in my decision letter, ignore these. Don't bother about them. Like, if there's some parts of the review which are useful, I'll share it with you, and then I'll tell you, just ignore the rest. Just pay attention to these things. But it's a really good point. It's something that I really do try, and all editors do this. Like, it's not just me, but all of my colleagues. We're very, very aware that we want people to judge the science. We don't want you to be judged because of who you are, where you're from, where you're doing your science, whom you're studying, who's your study population. That should not be relevant. That said, there is unconscious bias. So even though I really try, we're all just human and we might miss something. So if you feel that comments are unfair or they're motivated by something other than the science, you should raise that with the editor and say, this sounds, I'm not okay with this. There's something funny about this. You should look into it more, and we will.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. So we have been through more than 1 hour of crash course, I can say, to write scientific paper. And we hear from the people behind the desk that there is so much to do with the reviewing and also editing. So I hope we can gain insights by writing well and choosing well where to publish. And because of the time, I think I have to return this session to our MC, Anita. Thank you very much, Dr. Swapnika, for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Swapnika and Dr. Dai, for the very interesting discussion, and everyone for attending today's discussion. Now, before we end today's event, let's take a picture for documentation. So for everyone who's able to turn on their camera, please do turn on your camera. Okay. Okay, who will be taking the picture? Gasa?
Okay, give me
Okay.
a few seconds. Wait a second. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yep.
Okay, thank you. If you have any other question, don't hesitate to contact us on our Instagram account, Arkenco Research. And then you can see on the chat box, I think, okay, Gasa will post a link to our feedback form, and we would appreciate it if you would complete the